Welcome to Appalachia Rising, the podcast where we talk about ideas that are coming out of Appalachia that the rest of the world needs to hear about. We've got a special treat today. We're going to be talking to a former governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Governor Paul Patton. Paul, welcome. It's great to see you.
Good to be with you. This is a nice setup, beautiful scenery out there.
Yeah, it's a great place to do a podcast, isn't it? Absolutely. Well, I always start off by asking people a little bit about where they came from. So if you don't mind going back in time a little bit, talking about where you grew up and how you were educated, and tell us a little bit about your history.
And that could take the whole half hour.
Well, I'm sure it can.
I'll try to brief it out. I was raised I'm an Appalachian. I've never had a permanent home outside of Appalachia. But I was born in Fallsburg, about 75 miles north of Pikeville.
Okay.
Not exactly on the edge of the coal field. My grandfather was a coal miner. My other grandfather worked in the oil industry up around Ashland, Catlettsburg. My dad was a one-room school teacher for about 10 years in Lawrence County. Managed to educate himself through a correspondence and became a civil engineer and made a good living for us. I went to the University of Kentucky as a mechanical engineer. Came back to Floyd County and worked for my father-in-law. He taught me the coal business, helped me start a coal company here in Pike County. So for about 20 years I was a coal miner. And we sold the company and did pretty well. And I got interested in government. And somebody gave me the wild idea of running for governor of Kentucky. But they said, you need to get prepared for it. So I ran for county judge and learned politics and was county judge for 10 years, lieutenant governor for 4 years, and governor for 8 years. As lieutenant governor, I actually worked in Governor Burton Jones's cabinet as the Secretary of Economic Development, which gave me a perspective on what you need to do to grow an economy and some of the challenges that we still face here in Eastern Kentucky. But I've been blessed, and of course, I've been here at the University of Pikeville in August will be 10 years.
10 years.
And it's been one of the most pleasant experiences of my life. To see the young people come in here as a little shy and bashful and maybe not as sure of themselves as they should be.
Right.
And after 4 years, they walk out of here, they're ready to go out and conquer the world.
Absolutely.
Confident, ready to lead and educated to serve and to produce. So it's a great institution that I've been honored to have been associated with it.
Good. Well, you've been married for a number of years too, and I think it's best to get Miss Judy on the table right away. So, can you talk about your wife?
Today, Judy's a little bit under the weather with some bronchitis, but when we went to Frankfort as governor, that gives the First Lady a platform.
Yes.
And she used that very effectively in not the glamorous causes, but rather primarily abuse of women and children and neglect of women and children and breast cancer.
Right.
And she's established a tremendous reputation as an advocate for that segment of our society that needs some help every once in a while. So she did it on her own. She didn't ask me for permission to do it. She sort of informed me after she put together her staff. She told me after the fact.
Yep.
She didn't start and ask permission.
Well, that's how it is with first ladies sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think that you've just done a great promo for a future podcast, because I know that we want to have Judy Patton come on and talk about those issues.
Well, she can talk about those issues.
Child abuse and neglect and breast cancer. I think those are things that she's been passionate about for a long time. But one of the things that I want to talk to you about is education, because when you were in the governor's office, you were known as the education governor. And the podcast is centered around ideas that have their origin in Appalachia that need to be broadcast more widely than that, because we think there are great ideas from great people who live here that other people need to know about. So talk a little bit about what got you interested in education, and then how did that evolve into the way it shaped your government?
Well, being raised in Appalachia, I saw the wasted talent of people that were bright and thoughtful, but they just didn't have that education that it takes to develop those ideas and to promote them. when I graduated from the 8th grade at a little Fallsburg, a little 4-room rural school, less than half of the 8th grade graduates went to high school. And then out of 72 students that graduated from high school, 7 went to college. So, and then I got involved in the coal industry, working primarily with people with high school or less education for 20 years.
Yeah.
Great people, talented people, but they could coal, they could mine coal, but they really weren't prepared to do anything else.
Right.
And so I've seen the cost of the fundamental problem of Eastern Kentucky is not the mountains. There are mountainous regions around the world that have become prosperous.
Right.
It's the lack of education, and it's our history. We were populated originally by subsistence farmers. Didn't need much education. After the Civil War, we were populated by a group of immigrants coming off the boat and harvesting the Appalachian hardwoods and floating them down the river.
Right.
Didn't need much education. And then about 1905, the railroad got to Pikeville, and some of the best coal in the world was here on Marrowbone Creek in Pike County. One time I had 20,000 people living on Marrowbone.
Wow.
And probably don't have 1,000 today. But again, an industry that was dominated by manual labor up until after World War II. After World War II, the railroads quit using coal. The people started using natural gas in their homes. The industry mechanized, and the workforce was cut. 75% of those jobs were gone in 5 years after World War II was over.
And was that mostly mechanization, or was that a decrease in need for coal?
A decrease in need.
Okay.
The railroad was a big coal consumer.
And they went to diesel, right?
And they went to diesel.
Okay.
And people burned a lot of coal in their homes. And they went to natural gas.
Right.
And then the mines mechanized. Very similar to what we did today. But, you know, amazingly, there was a few people stayed around here for whatever reason.
Right.
And they picked up used equipment, and as I was telling Ronnie, they took an old truck rear end and front end and built a little cart with a little electric motor and an extension cord and started mining and built a new mining industry, of which I was a part, that brought a lot of the wealth that we have today. But over the last 15 or 20 years, we local people have sold out, and now the mining industry is dominated by big companies again.
Right.
And at one time there was 3,000 mines in Pike County. I think today there's 5.
Right. Right. And most of the miners are not here anymore.
That's right.
Yeah.
But so we had people that weren't well educated. They were poor, but because they weren't well educated, they didn't really understand that that's why they were poor. So many people did not appreciate education and the sacrifice that you have to make to get it.
Right.
You know, it doesn't matter how many scholarships you get for college, which you got to have today. You've got to sacrifice those 4 years. You could be out working in McDonald's and making minimum wage, have that car, and live independently.
Right.
But you've got to sacrifice these 4 years of college to be prepared for the workforce today. The United States is involved in mental labor, not manual labor. There's people all over the world that will work longer and harder for a lower standard of living than we're willing to live with here in the United States. And so we've got to do the mental work of the world. And it's going to take universities, large and small, like the University of Pikeville, to prepare these young people, like we're doing, for that world of the knowledge economy.
So let's go back to when you graduated 8th grade and then high school. What was it that set that spark alive in you that said, I need to go to the University of Kentucky and pursue my college education?
Well, my father, he was an educator all his life. As I said, he taught one-room schools for 10 years in Lawrence County, and he educated himself as a civil engineer through a correspondence course. I've still got his books. He's got little books that teaches him all about civil engineering. Became a registered professional surveyor, made a good living. And we'd be out in the woods hunting or something, and he'd tell me about this kind of tree. He knew every tree in the woods, and he could find ginseng. I never learned to find ginseng. I can find mayapple, but I couldn't find ginseng.
Right.
But he was an educator all his life.
And he was teaching you constantly, it sounds like.
Yeah. He, as children, I had 2 sisters, And he never missed an opportunity to point out something to us. It was just a given. Well, I'll tell you, when I was born, they weren't making very much, but they started saving one savings bond a month, which cost $17.
Right.
For a 25. In 10 years, that turned into $25. They would buy one for my education. Not my older sister, who was smarter than I was, and not my younger sister, who would work harder than I would, but the boy. It was the era when the man had to provide the living.
Right.
And so when I graduated from high school, I think they had a couple of $1,000 saved up for my education, not the two girls.
Yeah, and I think this is something that it might not be unique to Appalachia, but we see it in Appalachia. It's this decision to do something, you dedicate yourself to doing it, and then come hell or high water, you're going to get that thing done, whatever that is. And for your dad, it was education. So at the University of Kentucky, how did they craft your attitude toward learning?
Let me go back to what you said.
Oh, okay, that's
Dad,
fine.
Dad, and I talk to our athletes coming in sometimes about this.
Yes.
Do your best at everything you try. You won't succeed at everything, but you'll succeed at more than you lose at. And that's what I've done all my life. I've lost. One thing I wasn't afraid to do was to lose.
Right.
But I won more than I lost. And he said, as I tell our football players, I say, now, to say that I played football in high school is maybe an exaggeration, because I was a second team running back on a team that went 1-9. So I wasn't a very good player on what wasn't a very good football team.
Right.
But Dad would say, son, you do the best you can do, and I'll be proud of it.
Yeah.
And I think I wasn't the smartest bulb in the basket, but I'd work about as hard as any of them. And I think you'll find, as people will say, as governor, or even as county judge, I worked hard at it. And that's what we do with our athletic program.
Right.
Our coaches are interested in developing young men and women that have the right character of living by the rules and respecting authority and teamwork and leadership, and do your best.
Yeah.
And if you don't do your best, you don't get to play much. The coach will figure that out.
Yep.
And if you learn to do the best at anything you try, you'll be successful.
So talk for a minute about the University of Kentucky. Let's circle back to that. What did you learn there that helped prepare you for later parts of your life?
Well, it is amazing how naive that I was about the world. We had some television, but it was just 3 channels, and you didn't have this worldview that you have today on television.
Right.
When I went to Lexington from Louisa, I had never been any further north than Columbus, Ohio, no further west than Lexington, no further south than Pikeville, and no further east than Inez. And Inez is not very far east.
No, it is not.
I had no concept of how big the world was.
Right.
And I took all those aptitude tests, not like they got today, but it said I could be a doctor. But that took 8 years. I couldn't stay in college 8 years. I could be a lawyer, but that took 6 years. I couldn't stay in college. So I could be an engineer, and I could do that in 4 years. And UK was the only school that taught engineering.
Right.
So me and my high school best friend in high school went to UK, and we were lost ball in the high weeds. And at that time, UK was only about 4,000 students.
Right.
But other guys had gone there and one semester and said, hey, you guys are from Louisiana. You can't survive. They scared us to death. That first semester, we studied all the time. Didn't go to ball games, didn't date. We thought we were going to flunk out. I made a 3.75, and I said, well, this is not that bad. So I got involved, and I never did make another 3.75, I'll tell you that. But I got a good, well-rounded education at the University of Kentucky in engineering. I never became an engineer.
Right.
I became, but I did use a lot of the engineering in my mining business. So I would have, well, for the first 10 years of my 20-year career in mining, engineering was what I needed, because
Right.
engineering, coal mining is materials handling. But the last 10 years, I would have benefited with a business education.
Sure.
Because we'd grown and I could have been much more successful if I'd have understood some business principles.
Right, very good. So as you progressed into that second 10 years, how did you pick up those business principles? Was it just learning from people around you, or mentors?
I can't say that that I did the best job of it. I started in about 1959.
Okay.
And in 69, for those 10 years, it was tough. And I managed to produce efficient, build our own equipment, and did okay, made a little bit of money. But then in 69, there became a shortage of coal that was unbelievable. Coal that had been selling for $4 a ton started selling for $12 a ton. Now, there's a lot of difference between $4 a ton and $12 a ton.
Yes, there is.
In 72, coal that had been selling for $9 a ton started selling for $55 a ton. There's a lot of difference. And we did well. But there's so many more people here that saw the big picture, because they understood that it wasn't mining coal where you made the big money. It was owning the right to mine coal.
Right.
And while I was in the head of a hall mining coal, they were out here acquiring the right to mine coal and made much more money than I did, because they understood the bigger principle.
Right.
I didn't have any ambition. I had more coal under lease than I could figure on mining. I didn't ever think about acquiring the right to coal and then selling it, or the right to mine coal. So a lot of people, I did well, but a lot of other people did a lot better with it, never got their hands dirty, because they understood business principles that I didn't.
So talk about being county judge executive, and in this state, maybe you want to describe what that is a little bit, because people from outside of the Commonwealth will listen to this and watch this. So talk a little bit about the role of county judge executive, and then what were the things that you learned and what you're proud of in that role?
Oh, that's a big subject. But the county judge executive is not a judge.
Right.
They're totally an executive. Originally, back to about 1975, they were both. They had a judicial function. But they removed that in 75, and I became county judge in 82. So it was an executive. It's a lot like the mayor.
Okay.
And in Pike County, at that time, had about 85,000 people, and only about 6,000 lived in incorporated towns of Pikeville and Elkhorn City. So the vast majority of services that you would normally expect to be provided by the municipal government was provided by county judge.
Right.
Fire protection, police protection, swimming pools, recreation, senior citizens programs, and we started a rural garbage collection program, which is very difficult to do in a rural area. Pike County is a big county, but it's a heavily populated county. We don't have, about 95% of this county is mountainous and people don't live there. So it was a lot like running a city. And we modernized it, and I established a reputation as a progressive, honest, efficient government administrator, and I built that into becoming governor of Kentucky. So I enjoyed that job. I've had a good career. I've enjoyed everything I've done, but government is so different from business.
Yeah, talk about that for a minute, because you and I have had that conversation before.
A business person is, to many extents, a dictator. You say, I own it, we'll do it my way, make me happy. As I used to say, when I was in coal business, I was the boss. I could do anything the banker would loan me the money to do. That was the only fellow who could tell me what to do or not to do was my banker. In business, and in business, you've got owners that you got to please, and then you got customers that you've got to please only to get their business. But the stockholders are the ones you got to please. They can see that annual operating statement. That's where the objective is, to make money. And in government, you start with the money that your people are willing to give you, and then you figure out, how can I use that to best serve the people? And your stockholders are the same people as your customers. So it's a little bit, you got to satisfy them both ways.
Right.
You got to do it efficiently, but you got to give them what they want. So it's from state government perspective, education, elementary and secondary education, and higher education is the primary responsibility.
Right.
Can't spend all your money on education. You got to have courts, prisons, police, social services, and parks, and infrastructure. And how do you allocate that money? That's a political decision. And there's no scientific formula that will let you say, well, we'll get the greatest return on investment by spending this much in education. But you can do that in business. You can calculate return on investment,
right,
and make decisions. Can't do that. It's a political process, and it's guided by the people through their legislators. You're not a dictator. You're an administrator.
right.
In government, in our government, the people decide public policy through their legislators. That's the way the civic books teach it, and that's the way it is. And then the people hire an executive to execute that public policy that the governor didn't have any authority to make. But then they each have different policies. The governor also has the responsibility of leader to lead the public, to change public policy if that governor or that president or that county judge believes that a change needs to be made. But they've got to explain it to the people. And they've got to convince the people that it's the right thing to do. And if it's going to be important, it's probably going to be hard. Mm-hmm. There's going to be winners and losers. And the losers are more vocal than the winners, I'll tell you. So, but then you have to put that to the legislature. And if they won't pass it, you can't do it. Mm-hmm. The other side of that coin is the legislature has got to supervise and oversee the executive and make sure that that executive is implementing that public policy the way that they intended it to be done. And executives don't like that. Governors don't like that. Presidents don't like that. County judges don't like that. But you've got to be called. You've got to be called to account, and you've got to be. People have to analyze that, and find out. Well, is he doing that right, or is she doing that right? Mm-hmm. It's so much different from business, and business people like me sometimes have difficulty understanding that. It took me 2 or 3 years. I was pretty raw that first 2 or 3 years.
Right.
But fortunately, by the time that fourth re-election year came by, I had learned that every grandmother walking down the street, if she told me that her street needed to be fixed, I said, yes, ma'am, I'm going to try to do that. Mm-hmm. Now, trying to do something and doing it are two different things. Now, too many times in the county judges, people, you'd be out campaigning and our road needs to be fixed. I'll try to do that. Later, they go, you said you'd fix my road. I said, boy, no, I said I'd try, and I am trying, and I'm still trying. So it's you got a little psychology. You got to learn that. That's not the way it is. You don't learn that in business.
Right, right. Yeah, in business, you just make a decision, go do it.
That's right.
Yeah. Good. So when you were in the county judge's office, it really piqued your interest in politics, and you decided to pursue a lieutenant governor's position. Talk about that. How did that decision come about?
Let me back up a little bit before
Okay,
that.
that's fine.
For about 12, 14 years, I stayed in the head of a Hall of Mining Coal.
Right.
Made a little bit of money, and politicians like money. And so politicians got acquainted with me, and I did start contributing and supporting some politicians. Governor Wendell Ford and other people got me to be a delegate to the Democrat National Convention in Miami in 1972.
Okay.
And that was an eye-opening experience to see that on that grand scale. And then during the 70s, I got very involved in explaining coal's position in Washington. The federal government started making increases in safety and environmental regulation that made coal mining better that I was interested in, because I wanted to be safe and I wanted to do it environmentally soundly. Right. And I didn't want to compete with people who weren't doing it that way.
Right.
And so I was a proponent of reasonable regulation. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes people get under, but I became a spokesman for the small coal operator in the United States. And
so a lobbyist, really.
For myself, not a paid lobbyist.
Sure, yeah,
but an advocate.
Yeah. Right,
for that.
right.
And so in 78, a United States congressman, I had sold my company and had some money, and he wanted me to run for governor and finance my own race. So for 3 days in Kentucky, I was running for governor. My friends told me I wasn't qualified. I couldn't win, and if I did win, I wouldn't be qualified to do the job. But as a result of that and some other things, again, I sold out in 78, and we get to 81, and I've been around the house too long. Judy's wanting to get me out of Dodge. You know how that goes. And I sat down and I said, hey, the people are encouraging me to run for governor, but I've got to be prepared. And I want to run for governor, for county judge. This was in 80.
Right.
So I want to run for county judge in 81 and get elected, and run for re-election in 85, and run for lieutenant governor in 91, and then run for governor in 87, and run for governor in 91. Now, I laid out that plan in about March of 1980, and I worked that plan. And I won the county judge's race, and I won re-election, and I ran for lieutenant governor in 87, and I got beat. And getting beat in politics is not a lot of fun.
No.
They're rejecting you as a person, not your product, not in business, you're a person. For the only time in my life I was depressed, the only time in my life I've ever been depressed, for about 2 months. But I got re-involved in the governor's race that fall. And you know, in politics, it takes 2 people to encourage you to run, and that's a movement. And 3 people is a draft. So as I traveled Kentucky in that fall governor's race, people said, Paul, why don't you run again? And so I ran again for lieutenant governor in 91, and I won, and then I ran for governor in 95. So it was a planned program that started in 1980.
Yeah. And so when you got to the governor's office, what were your top 2 or 3 issues that you were interested in having an impact?
Well, bottom line was jobs.
Okay.
I ran a campaign, and there's a long story to that, but I ran a campaign, Jobs R Us, jobs, jobs, jobs. When I made my first inaugural speech, I said, we're going to work on post-secondary education. I made an impassioned speech on improving the colleges in Kentucky. When I got through, the staff said, and the press said, where'd that come from? You didn't talk about education. I said, well, people want jobs, but in today's world, they have to be educated better than they are in Kentucky. And in 1990, Kentucky had made historic commitments to elementary and secondary education.
Right.
Nation leading. I can talk an hour on what Kentucky did in 1990 to build that foundation for a post-secondary education.
Right.
But you know, in today's world, a high school education is only the foundation. You can't live in a foundation.
Right.
You got to build a house. And post-secondary education, be it 1 year, or be it 2 years, or be it 4 years, or 8 years of after high school education, is what prepares you for today's workforce in the United States. And that's where Kentucky was deficient.
Right.
And we did make major in 98, major 97, in May of 97, we passed a major improvement, commitment to basically the public colleges, but also we did some things that helped the independent colleges, because I'd been involved with Pikeville since the 70s with the Pikeville College.
Right.
And so the biggest thing we did was the scholarship fund.
Right.
We devoted all of our lottery revenue, which at that time was about $200 million, to college scholarships to any accredited college. And that has made a big difference at all of the 19 independent colleges in Kentucky.
It has.
So I became known, not just in Kentucky, but nationally, as the education governor, because I advocated for education. When Governor Bush took office, within the first 2 months, he called about 10 governors to Washington to talk about education in its broadest form. And I was one of those 10. And I became an advocate. I led about every national education association that the governors were involved with. So education is, the United States has to do the mental work. Communication is so vast. Transportation is so cheap that there's people all over the world that will do manual labor for a lower standard of living than we're willing to accept.
Right.
So we have to do and continue to do, like we've done for the last 80 years since the GI Bill. We have to do the middle work of the world. That's where our prosperity comes from.
Absolutely.
And we've got to continue to do it. To continue to be a leader, we got to continue to provide the highest higher education in the world, and we still do that. We're losing a little ground because people are gaining on us. It's not that we're losing ground; it's that they're gaining on us. And as far as elementary and secondary education, the rest of the world, many places in the world are doing, they're equally to us and maybe doing a little bit better job.
Right.
But we still have to maintain the lead in higher education. We've got some great research universities, and that's where the ideas that grow your economy come from.
That's right.
And then your master degree programs builds the highly specialized people that put that into effect, as do the bachelor degree programs. So it's a combination of various skills that makes our economy work the way it does. And we're still a leader, and we got to keep being a leader.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. We're going to pause there for just a couple of minutes, and we'll come back in a minute or two. I want to follow up with a question on using lottery funds to help fund education, because I think that was a pretty innovative idea at the time. So we'll come back with that in just a minute. Let's take a break.
You're listening to Appalachia Rising, presented by the University of Pikeville.
Welcome back to Appalachia Rising. We're here with Governor Paul Patton, talking about some of the things that he was able to accomplish during his gubernatorial administration. And I want to return to that idea of using lottery funds to fund higher education, because if I remember correctly, Kentucky was one of the first that made that decision. Is that true?
Probably the second.
Second one, okay.
Well, when I was running we had passed the lottery under Governor Wilkinson probably in the mid-'80s.
Okay.
And he campaigned on a veterans bonus, a one-time veterans bonus, and a program for senior citizens, and a program for early childhood development. But somehow or the other, everybody all got the idea that the lottery was meant for education. So as you would go around talking to people, well, we need more money, they'd say, well, for education.
Right.
They'd say, well, I thought the lottery was supposed to fund education. They wanted any of it going to education. So Georgia, the governor of Georgia had called it the Hope Program in Georgia. And they took all of their lottery money, they started the lottery, and they allocated it to students that made a B average. It was black or white. If you made a C plus, you got nothing. If you made a A minus, you got this full scholarship,
right.
which wasn't a full scholarship, but it was a major scholarship. It's all the same. So I said, well, that puts too much pressure on the grading. Let's do it a little different. So we developed a system where every year in high school, whatever you made that year, your GPA that year, would give you a partial scholarship. If you made a 3.5, you got $500 for a 4-year scholarship. That was $2,000 you already earned. Now, as a sophomore, if you backed off a little bit and made a 3, you got $400 for all 4 years. Mm-hmm. But then if as a junior, you got up and studied and made a perfect, so over the 4 years of high school, you could accumulate an annual scholarship for 4 years in college. And then when you took your ACT tests, based on your score there, you could get another $500. So you could earn up to $2,000 a year toward your college education over 4 years in high school. And then you didn't use that money for the next 4 years. So it really took 8 years to implement that program fully.
Right.
Which meant that we could take a little bit of the lottery money every year, something we could afford, and it increased about a tenth every year or a 12th every year. And so it allowed us to implement that. And it allowed parents to say to Johnny when he starts as a freshman in high school, now Johnny, you got to go to college. But now you're going to have to work and earn part of it yourself. And so you're going to have to earn this scholarship called the Keys Scholarship, Kentucky Education Excellence Scholarship. And at the end of the year, you could sit Johnny down and say, now Johnny, you didn't do as well as you should have done. Now I expect you to do better next year. Parents, for years and years after I left Frankfort, parents would come up to me and say, boy, I appreciate that Keys Scholarship. Now they don't know I got anything to do with it. But it was something, it just worked out really good, and it gave students and parents a motivation to improve their grades in high school. And it wasn't all black and white. So you didn't have all that pressure on grade inflation when it got down. And if a guy came in a little bit short, he's upset because he got nothing. So I think it's been, and you know, it now, but now there was another scholarship. When I went down there was a small scholarship called the CAP program, College Tuition Assistance or something. And it was about $2,000, but they only had about $10 million in it. And so when they ran out of money, they ran out of scholarships. So it was for Pell, if you were Pell eligible, the federal scholarship, you were eligible for the full cap, $2,000. And there was another little scholarship that's about $3,000 now for students at independent colleges like the University of Pikeville, to sort of make up for the state aid that the state gave to the public colleges. But it's only like $5 million. So they ran out of money, you know, it's first come, first served. So we put 55% of the money in the need, what you call 55% in the needs base. That was the CAP and the KTG. Because you had to be Pell eligible, which meant you had to be from a lower income family. And we put 45% into the Keys program. So now that for the colleges, I would say most of the undergraduates here take advantage of those scholarships. It makes a big difference. But it's one of the things that we're real proud of. And I had another thought that I forgot, so I'll come back to it in a minute.
So let me follow up the question, and then maybe you'll think about that too. From the time you implemented those scholarships until the time they were fully funded and fully operational, what happened to the number of students in the Commonwealth of Kentucky that attended college?
Way up. Way up.
Do you have an estimate of how
many? I don't know, but it went up, and it was an incentive. And I know what I was going to say. Now, that 45% is not enough to cover the obligation. With the other scholarships, they say when the money's gone, no more scholarships because people haven't become eligible for them. But with the Keys Scholarship, these students have been going for 4 years being told that they've earned this scholarship. And so now, to the extent that the lottery, 45%, doesn't produce enough money to fully fund the Keys, they'll bring it out of the general fund. So the Keys Scholarship has not been changed since we left. And the CAP and the KTG scholarships have been increased dramatically because we went from probably $15 million to $100 million for that program, or $120 million for those two programs.
Well, I think that's impacted thousands of students.
Well, and it gets them to thinking about college as a freshman in high school. Which most of them don't do.
Yeah, it puts motivation on them early on. That is as much of a motivation as getting a part-time job to pay for school. So that's been a really good program.
You earn $2,000 a year. That's not bad.
That's not bad. It's probably more than I earned in any given summer. Well, that's fantastic. So in addition to those things, and we will come back to Miss Judy and her work later, what are some other things that, that happened during your time in the governor's office that you're especially proud of?
Actually, we did a lot of things environmentally. I couldn't go into detail, but I think and I'm a coal operator. You don't expect a coal operator to be an environmentalist. But I think if you talk to some of the leading environmentalists in Kentucky today, they said, yeah, we had a ear with Paul Patton. He listened to us. He took our advice on some things, and we had a dramatic impact on local law enforcement in Kentucky. We required, first state in the union, to require all local police officers and sheriff's deputies to have a 14-week training program to learn how to be a police officer. Before that, if the sheriff wanted to put a badge on somebody's shoulder, on their hip, on their chest, and a gun on their shoulder, and say, you're a sheriff and you've got a right to go out here and arrest people and to kill them if you have to, they didn't have to have any training. That was the first, that program is still strong today. Down at Eastern Kentucky University, we have the Criminal Justice Academy. And every person that gets a job in professional law enforcement has to go through that program. We revised the criminal justice system to put more emphasis on serious crimes and more leniency on less serious crimes. The incarceration in Kentucky has still continued to increase, which needs to be looked at.
Right.
But I think we made, on the juvenile justice program, at that time, juvenile crime was handled by the county. And they had to, juvenile incarceration was handled by the county. And the counties weren't equipped to do it. And it wasn't a juvenile development program or correction program. It was a juvenile warehousing program. Very destructive.
Right.
Before I got into office, the federal government had issued Kentucky a government order that said you've got to improve your juvenile justice or you lose all federal aid.
Oh, wow.
And so I immediately began, and the state took over the juvenile justice system. And we built about 8 regional juvenile justice facilities with complete training and counseling and psychological help. And before Janet Reno left office at the end of the Clinton administration, she came to Kentucky and said, from having the worst juvenile justice system in the United States, Kentucky has the best. And we did have the best, and I think we still have one of the best. So we were looking at the fundamental things that affect the people. We were looking at education, criminal public protection, and social services. We continued to improve the social services programs in Kentucky. So I'm very proud of it. I think we came out of office as a very, no scandals in the administration. So we came out as a very progressive administration.
Good. There's one more thing I want to ask you about, though, because it impacts us locally, and I know that you played a role in this. Sometime in the late 90s, about 95 or 96, discussions started taking place in Eastern Kentucky about starting a 3rd medical school in the Commonwealth. What role did you play in that process? And talk about Chad Perry and some of those guys, too, and how they contributed to starting a medical school here.
Well, Chad Perry was a very successful attorney in Paintsville, and I read in the newspaper that Chad Perry said that he would put up $1 million to establish a medical school in Paintsville. And I said, that's the craziest thing that I've ever heard. Chad has lost his mind. But Chad got with Berlin Coleman, who was a trustee here at the University of Pikeville.
Right.
And Berlin said, Chad, you don't have the infrastructure in Paintsville to have that kind of a school. But we would have it here in Pikeville, at Pikeville College at the time. And so Berlin convinced, and I was campaigning for the last 2 of the years, so I was sort of out, I was still on the board, but I was sort of out of touch. But Berlin and the board convinced Chad to bring that $1 million to Pikeville. And so the board voted to put in an application for a medical school with the American Osteopathic Association. At about the same time, I became governor.
Uh-huh.
And so on a Sunday, in '96, I hadn't been in office 4 or 5 months. And Chad and Berlin and I think Terry Dodson and 3 or 4 people came to my house down in the Bowles Edition on Sunday afternoon, and they explained it to me. And I said, well, if you all think you can make it work, I'll do my part. And so we had a hearing coming up in Chicago to justify how are you going to do that in a little town and a little college like Pikeville.
Uh-huh.
How can you do that? And they explained the mechanics of how they were going to get it done. And I said, and I'm governor, and I'll make sure that we raise the money to do it. Not from government money, but from private money.
Uh-huh.
And so they said, okay, we don't think you can do it. But if you want to try, we'll give you permission to go through this first step. And so we did it. We converted rooms over we built a medical school on friction tape and bale wire. For farmers know what that is, and coal miners know what that is.
I know what that is,
we
too.
stuck it together one way or the other, and we had Dean Stroh-Schneider. He probably cut a few corners, but we got it done.
Yep.
And then later on, when I became president here in 2009, and about 2010, we ended up building this about $45 million building out here.
That's
That's
right.
got some of the most modern technology in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that has led to the building that we're in with the optometry college. And this is the most modern college of optometry in the United States. We have the latest technology. There's only 22 of them.
Right.
And we have the most latest technology, the greatest facility. As you know, I've said often, 10 years from now, we're going to be the Mayo Clinic of optometry. You know, Rochester, Minnesota is not in the middle of the world. Now, Pikeville's not in the middle of the world, but we're in the middle of some of the most difficult vision problems in the United States, right here in Appalachia. So we're right where the problem is. And we've got the kind of facility that will teach these optometrists. So next year, we admit our 4th and final class. So the year after that, we'll start actually graduating optometrists, just like we started graduating physicians. And when we started the medical school, this whole region was medically underserved. No longer the case.
That's right.
Because when you admit people from the mountains, they get trained in the mountains. A lot of them stay in the mountains. They stay home. So we have, and that's the same way with optometry. We'll be addressing the problems. And 10 years from now, I think we could be known as the place to go to get difficult eye problems solved.
Yeah, I think so too. And this is where I think I want to end the podcast, because this whole podcast is about ideas that grow out of Central Appalachia that need to be exported elsewhere. And one of the great ideas that has resulted from your gubernatorial administration, from your presidential time here, and from the fact that you're still chancellor and still serving this institution, is the move toward medical education, and specifically now the move toward optometric education that is really going to change the way optometry looks for the next 50 years. It's a great idea, and it's one that was born here and grew here, and in large part is thanks to you. So
And
thank you, sir.
And a
It's
lot of the
always good to
things
see
like
you.
coal mining that going to leave, healthcare is not going to leave. It's
That's
going
right.
to be with
It's
us for
going
a
to be
long
with us
time.
for as long as we got people.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Dr.
so
Webb.
thank you, folks. Thanks for joining us with another edition of Appalachia Rising, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you for joining us on this edition of Appalachia Rising. For more information on this episode or others, visit www.upike.edu/Appalachia Rising.